morning, everybody. I'm going to try and not to go on too long, as Mogi said. Those of us in qualitative tend to talk a lot more, so I'll try and keep it relatively brief. I think first of all I need to say that I am not an expert in qualitative methods. I come from a positivist background. I was brought up on quantitative research. But I have been introduced to qualitative research, and I have had the opportunity to start delving into doing some qualitative research myself. So I really am just sharing what I've learned along the way, and what other people have taught me to a large extent. And two people in particular come from my own PhD studies. Leyland Pitt and Julie Tinston are experts in qualitative research. And so I must acknowledge that a lot of the stuff that I'm telling you actually comes directly from them. And then I actually learned quite a lot in preparing for this seminar. So, I think reading also teaches us a lot, but obviously doing is the best way to learn. All right, the plan is to talk about some of the qualitative data collection tools, the ways that we can collect the data. And there are three main areas for data collection: the interviews, the focus groups, and the observations. I'm going to talk about each of those separately, but as you've seen already, techniques like ethnography, for example, actually involve combinations of those. So it's not common for us just to be using one of those techniques, particularly if we're using a mixed method approach. Invariably, we'll be using more than one of those. My objective is to expose you to these tools. There are lots of them, and in fact, I'm going to contradict Mogi at times when I start introducing you to some of the newer tools where, in fact, it goes against kind of the theory of qualitative. For example, not getting out of your office. There's some really cool ways to collect qualitative data where you can do it from your desk and your computer. But they're not the common methods, and I'm going to go through the common methods first before I talk about those. I'm certainly not trying to teach you how to do. Once you've decided what tools to use, then it's up to you to go out there and look at the nitty-gritty of how to do it. And there's lots out there in all your research books, particularly the qualitative ones. Okay, so let's start off by looking at interviews. Basically, there are three different types of interview. We can talk about a structured interview, a semi-structured, and an in-depth or unstructured interview. Now, generally, the second two are more qualitative in nature. A structured interview is pretty much a questionnaire where you've got open-ended questions. And some would argue that that's not real qualitative data collection. Basically, your interviewer is not interacting with your respondent. They are really just there to read out the question and to record the responses to that. Whereas qualitative research, as Mogi said, is very much about the interactive. It's about giving as much as you're receiving in terms of the research. It's about the depth, the richness that comes out of the research. And so I would probably side with those who say that a structured interview is not really qualitative research. But semi-structured and in-depth or unstructured interviews are definitely tools for qualitative research. So in a semi-structured interview, the researcher has a set of questions that they go through. There's a plan to it. But what it does allow is that the researcher can ask probing questions. In other words, they can deviate off the set list of questions that they've come in with. And that's where you get the depth. So you're not just asking standardized questions. A structured interview will involve the researcher asking exactly the same questions in exactly the same way of every respondent. And it's really important that it is maintained that way, because you're trying to compare the data. You're trying to compare what respondent X versus Y said with a structured interview. So it's important that they get exactly the same kind of response from the interviewer. When we talk about semi-structured, we want to be able to deviate. We want to pursue a particular avenue that's going to lead us to more depth of understanding. And that's what the probing questions are for. So although we have a set of questions, we are allowed to deviate from that with semi-structured. And that's where the advantage comes. With an unstructured interview, or sometimes you'll see an in-depth interview, there it is really a conversation or a dialogue with somebody. Very often it starts with asking a very broad question of the respondent. Tell me about your work environment, for example. And then the respondent, to a large extent, or the participant, leads the conversation. Obviously, it has a purpose. It's not a conversation. A conversation on its own has no purpose. This is an interview, so it has a purpose. There's certain information that we're trying to get out. So the researcher will guide the conversation, but that's as much as they'll be involved in kind of set questions. There's no format, there's no structure to an unstructured interview. And the purpose really is to understand, and as Mogi said, particularly the full depth of the situation. We want to know all of the variables that are having an impact here. We want to know the feelings, the attitudes, the opinions, everything we can about the phenomenon that we're looking at. So the objectives of interviews are basically to explore the context in which you find the phenomenon. So if we're looking at women in a work environment, Mogi used that example, we want to know everything there is about the situation that women face themselves in a work environment. And that might mean also looking at what happens at home, because that has an impact on the work environment. So we would want to understand all elements of the phenomenon. We also want to explain behavior. Very often with quantitative data, we can't explain why things happen. We can say X and Y happens, but we can't understand the why, the feelings behind it. So that's very much an objective of qualitative research using the interview format. We also want to evaluate. We want to know how things have panned out. Let's say in a work environment we've implemented, and without getting into touchy area, a new performance management system. And we want to understand how effective that has been. We want to evaluate the responses to that. So an interview allows us to do that. We can ask what happened, why, what are people's perceptions of it, what caused that particular reaction. So it's evaluating the effectiveness of something or the impact of something. And then, as Mogi said, qualitative research, particularly with interviews, may lead to the generation of theories. Now, I would suggest that you don't attempt this yet. This is something that comes out of doing qualitative research for a very long time, that you actually develop theory out of the data that you get in interviews. At this stage, most of us are not there. All right, so some of the pros and cons of using interviews particularly, the main advantage is that depth of information that we can get. The richness of the data is something that is the main reason for doing qualitative research. It allows us to investigate complex or sensitive topics. An interview is a one-to-one situation, so people are more inclined to share their feelings about sensitive topics in an interview setting than they would in any other kind of setting. In a focus group, for example, which we'll talk about just now, which is pretty much a group-type interview, sensitive topics do not work well. Okay, because people feel intimidated, they don't want to talk about them in front of others. And in an interview, you have the opportunity to build rapport and to build trust with the person. Long interviews have become very popular. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more just now. 3 to 4 hour interviews, because of the ability of the interviewer to really understand this individual, to know them so that they trust them enough to tell them everything there is to know about that particular topic. So you can deal with complex or sensitive topics. As Mogi said, you can pick up the verbal and the non-verbal. Now, a questionnaire doesn't allow you to do that. Quantitative research doesn't let you see how people respond to things. What's their body language when they're responding to something? Do they look nervous or agitated when they're asking that question or answering that question? You wouldn't pick that up in a quantitative tool, and often in a group-based data collection tool, you won't pick that up either. So the interview really allows you to pick up the non-verbal with the verbal. There's a lot more flexibility in terms of venue and timing. You can set up the interview for where the person is most comfortable. So interviews often will happen in the person's home, for example. If we're interviewing children, we're not going to bring them into an office-type setting because they're not going to feel comfortable there. So we can be flexible about where we do interviews, and we can time them to suit, obviously, the interviewer, but mainly the interviewee. Follow-up is possible. Using purely interview-based research often involves writing up of the transcripts and then taking those transcripts back to the interviewee and saying, this is how I interpreted our conversation. Do you agree? Can we pursue this? I'm not quite sure what you were saying here. And so it really allows you to do more of a kind of longitudinal type of data collection. You can follow up on issues that you're not sure about. And you can get beyond the socially accepted view. Very often with group-based qualitative tools, people say what they think is socially acceptable. Okay, whereas in a one-to-one situation, particularly if you've built the trust, you can get away from that socially accepted view. There are cons. As Mogi said, it's expensive, it's time-consuming, and it costs money to set up a series of interviews with people, particularly if they are long. Often, if you're interviewing busy people, you actually need to pay them to do the interview, so it can be very costly. It introduces bias, and I'm actually reluctant to put bias there as a con, because the whole reason for doing qualitative research is that it is subjective, that it is a dialogue, that it is my interpretive approach to this research. So the fact that it's biased in terms of my interpretation is not really a con. That's a positivist approach, to put bias there as a con. Because the positivist, the quantitative person, will say bias is a problem. Bias is something you don't want. But actually, qualitative research is about the interpretation. And so, yeah, this comes obviously from the books, but I'm reluctant to put that there. It's not generalizable. And again, it's not meant to be generalizable. Leyland Pitt always talks about how research, and I wrote these down, basically tries to achieve three things. Either we're trying to achieve precision, okay, or we're trying to achieve generalizability, or we're trying to achieve causality. Okay, those are the three things. And no research can achieve all three of those things. Not any research. Quantitative research will allow you to generalize. Qualitative research gives you precision. You know about that particular thing in depth. And to do causality, you need to do experimental research. And so each different type of research achieves different things. It's not meant to be generalizable if it's qualitative research. You do need qualified and experienced interviewers. I know we all think, qualitative is really easy research. I just have to go and do 10 interviews. There you go, data collection done. It's not like that. Interviewing is complicated. There are skills that are required, and there's lots of textbooks telling you about what those skills are and how to go about it. But you actually need to practice. You need to develop those skills and build that experience. Subjective interpretation. It's always a good idea, and I might be impinging on your section, Sean, but to have multiple interpreters of qualitative data. In other words, multiple coders, multiple interpreters. So we were told never try and publish qualitative research on your own. It should always be group-based, and you should always have multiple coders. And that's so that other people can look at what you've written and what you've got in your transcripts and see if they would come to the same interpretation. You want it to be valid research at the end of the day. Okay, so it has a reputation of being subjective, but we still want it to be valid research. In other words, if you look at my notes based on the interview, you would come to the same conclusions. And therefore, it's useful to have multiple people involved. It relies on the ability of the participant to recall and articulate answers. And this is a problem. If the interviewee is unable either to recall the stuff that you're asking them to recall, or to actually articulate it, to put it into words, then you're not going to get the data that you need. And that can be a problem with particular topics. Just some final points in terms of interviews. You sacrifice the bias for the trust and depth of information, and as I say, that's our purpose, is to get that depth. It's important to build rapport and trust. I've mentioned that. The greater skill is needed, the less structure there is. So unstructured interviews are not something you want to get involved in if you've never done interviewing before. You really need to build skills and expertise first. Long interviews, as I say, are currently becoming popular, and one of the reasons for that is that people don't remember stuff in chunks of information. If we ask them a question, we want a quick answer. They don't remember stuff like that. People remember stories. And so the long interview allows storytelling. It allows the individual to tell the story as they remember it, as memory is constructed. And that's therefore giving you a much more real and in-depth kind of basis to the information. It's then up to you to get your answers out of it. But that's one of the reasons why the long interviews are becoming popular. It's very important that you ask for permission to record. Okay, it is unethical to record interviews without permission. And as I say, you should always get your transcripts checked, ideally by the interviewee. That improves the validity of the data, but also by somebody else who's interpreting the transcripts. Right, then I'm introducing projective techniques, and I have to tell you that I know very little about projective techniques. But they are a technique that is often actually used today with other techniques. So for example, in a focus group, you may use some kind of projective technique. They are usually conducted by professionals, which is why I don't know much about them. And they're aimed at surfacing deeper and unconscious thoughts. The kind of rationale behind it is that people don't always understand how they feel or articulate how they feel about something. And so if you can get to their unconscious thoughts, then you're getting the real truth in terms of how they feel. So they're apparently much better for capturing emotionality than rationality. So in other words, how people feel about things. They're generally exploratory. In other words, you wouldn't publish using projective techniques. You would use them to support other data that you've collected. These particular types come from Whedon and Higgins, and they say there are associative techniques, and those are things like word associations. I'm sure you've all done those sometime in your life. Someone says a word to you. In fact, there's an advert on, I'm not sure who it's for, OLS, I think, on the radio at the moment with word associations. So you say a word and someone has to think of the first word that comes to mind. You can also do that with pictures. So presenting respondents with a picture and seeing what comes to mind. It's particularly useful for, and I come from a marketing perspective, so apologies for my examples being mostly marketing, but for positioning, to understand how consumers see a particular brand. What is the first word that comes to mind when I say Volvo? I guarantee a lot of you would say safety. That's something that we use quite a lot in positioning studies, so it could be used for that. Then there's completion techniques. That's where you give half a sentence and you ask people to complete it, or you give them a picture and you ask them to tell the story around it. That's also a completion technique. Then there are construction techniques. Thematic appreciation, TAT, some of you might have come across that, is very similar in that you're giving them a picture and you then ask them questions about it. Why are those people looking like that? Why is that there? What do you think they would be doing next? That's thematic appreciation, and I would advise that you get an expert to do that for you. Cartoon appreciation is something I actually have seen. One of my colleagues has done cartoon analysis. She's looked at what perceptions in society are of salespeople and how perceptions have changed over time through cartoons. So she's done cartoon analysis. Greenberg is one of the good sources if you're interested in doing that. So that's looking at how people perceive different cartoons. Collages is actually one I have used. That's where you get respondents to draw up or make up a collage of a particular topic. So I've used it with teenagers looking at what they perceive as green, environmentally friendly. And they had to build, in fact, they drew a collage for me, and then they explained that to me. So I've got both audio and visual material, which has given me a huge amount of depth of information to understand their understanding of that particular concept. And then draw-write technique is similar. You can ask them to draw your picture and tell you about it. That's also a construction technique. And then expressive techniques are things like role plays, where you get people to be somebody else. Very often, the theory behind projective techniques is that people can't tell you themselves. They don't want to talk about themselves, but if they can project onto something else or someone else, then it's easier for them to tell you the story. So if you get them to play a role, the theory is that they can't play that role without giving something of themselves, because automatically their own views, their own opinions are going to come out in the role play. So that's another way of getting people to uncover their information. And then there were lots of others. If you look up projective techniques, you'll see things like laddering. That's where you have different concepts and you get people to rank them. So for example, again, in marketing research, we would use that to see which attributes are more important to a consumer. If they were choosing a beer, would it be the taste, would it be the color, and to start moving these different attributes around. Personification, taking a brand, again, for example, and putting human characteristics to it. So how would you describe this brand as a person? Also seen it used with animals. So if you had to put an animal term to this brand, what would it be? Why would it be those terms? And then brand mapping, usually with two different dimensions, and just taking pictures of the brands and putting them on to that brand map to see how people perceive the different brands. So those are all projective techniques, as I say, usually used in combination with either an interview or possibly a focus group. Then focus groups, I'm sure you've all heard of focus groups, and in fact, unfortunately, focus groups have kind of got a bad name. We were told at one of the Meet the Editors sessions I went to this year that certain journals will not publish if you mention focus groups in them. So I think it's got a bad reputation, but I think it's mainly because people have used them incorrectly. I think focus groups have a lot of good qualities, but there are a lot of people out there that are using them incorrectly. All right, it's basically a group-based semi-structured interview in that we prepare a set of questions for the focus group. It's controlled by the moderator. The moderator takes people through those questions, but it does allow for discussion. And one of the main things that you're looking for with the focus group is the interaction between people. So where in an interview, we really just want to get the individual response. In a focus group, we're wanting to see what kind of interaction there is. Generally 6 to 10 participants. Some people say 8 to 12, but most books seem to say about 6 to 10 participants. They're selected purposefully. And so your random sampling doesn't apply to focus groups. You really want to choose people who have a similar kind of level of knowledge about the phenomenon that you're looking at. You may choose to have mixed groups from other demographic factors. So, for example, you might have a mixed gender group, although very often we will split genders, for example. We might split ages so that we've got different focus groups. Rule of thumb, given I think you're talking about sampling, I've been told rule of thumb with focus groups is you keep going, you do as many focus groups until you stop getting new information. This is a bit vague. I'm sure you'll give us a better way to decide on that. The moderator, as I say, guides the discussion, ensures participation and elaboration. So again, you're looking for the depth. You want the probing questions to be able to get more information. You want the interaction, so you need to foster that as a moderator. And again, you can't just go in and do a focus group without some kind of training and preparation. Good moderation is what makes focus group data useful. You're looking for group views as opposed to an interview, obviously, where we're looking for the individual's views. Here you really are looking at the group's views. It's very useful for developing ideas. One of the main benefits of a focus group is that they spark off. Someone will say something and it'll spark off interest from someone else, and they'll start thinking about another angle. As I say, composition varies. You can have similar groups across the phenomenon. The phenomenon has to be what binds them together, but you can have similarity of, as I say, genders, or you could choose to put genders together. Generally, you will split up things like ages, but you can also have experts versus non-experts. Generally, you wouldn't put those into the same group because the experts will intimidate the non-experts in that area. Increasingly combined with projective techniques, as I said, in my particular case where I used the collages, we did that in a focus group setting. So they were divided up into pairs to do the collages, and then they presented those back to the group. And there are lots of online developments. We're starting to see online focus groups now. You can use chat rooms, for example, for focus groups. So it kind of takes you away from actually being there with the people. There are pros and cons to them. They obviously have drawbacks, but it does allow you, for example, much bigger samples, total samples that you can draw from. You can have cross-cultural. You could be looking at different countries, focus groups in different countries to look at the same topic. And that's all sort of possible with technology. Okay, just some pros and cons here. Pros, it surfaces a wide range of attitudes and opinions because of the sparking off of ideas from different people. It surfaces differences. Okay, so you're getting lots of different angles to the phenomenon. It allows you to look at the interactions, as you were saying, how people interact is an important part of it. It's a whole different set of data, if you like, is the interactions that take place. Creativity has been found to be enhanced with focus groups. It's useful to generate questions for quantitative research, and this is kind of coming back to the mixed methods. Very often